means Major Garrett's joining us, and that's why Led Zeppelin's playing in the background. Of course, Major is the chief Washington correspondent for CBS News, at Major CBS on Twitter. His new book is coming out here in less than 2 weeks. It's called The Big Truth, and you can, by the way, find it at thebigtruthbook.com, and also the host of the Takeout podcast, which this week, Major, you had a chance to visit with former White House attorney Ty Cobb. Obviously, a lot still going on with the Mar-a-Lago raid and the special master being appointed this weekend. I'm curious to get a sneak preview of what you guys talked about.
So one of the things that was most interesting in our conversation with Ty Cobb, and to just refresh the audience's memory, he was the attorney inside the White House that dealt with the Robert Mueller investigation into Russia. And he was the one who represented the institution of the White House, but the president's interest in that case, and did so successfully. And has a lot of thoughts about the origins of the Russia investigation. Those thoughts are not complimentary to the FBI or the Justice Department at all. That being said, Ty Cobb said, this is a legitimate investigation. The documents were clearly at Mar-a-Lago. They should not have been there. And I said, what do you think it's about? He said, I think it's about January 6th. I think it's about trying to find other things relevant to either instructions or conversations or evidence that might still be in former President Trump's possession related to all the means by which he tried to hold on to power, in Ty Cobb's words, unconstitutionally, and try to overturn the 2020 election. And that surprised me. I didn't think that this would be as inclusive as that. He said, to my way of reading everything the Justice Department has filed, the broadness of the search warrant itself, I think it's about something bigger than just this document dispute.
Well, Major, I have been obviously following the story, reading all of the news that I can absorb, and I have to admit, I'm still very confused exactly what was there. As you mentioned, looks like the investigation focuses on January 6th, but then the timeline. What do we expect as far as a timeline, as information coming out, and any action being taken other than kind of these leaks about what it is or isn't?
Right. So a lot of questions there. Leaks are injurious to anyone who's subject to an investigation of any kind. And anyone has a right to complain about leaks. And certainly those on the Trump side do. Things get in the media that clearly or appear to have come from the Justice Department, although we can't be sure about that. The Attorney General, Merrick Garland, has said, we're not going to do anything other than file our evidence in court. So if you want to hear what the Justice Department thinks about this or any other case, look at our court filings. And yet there are stories, like there was earlier this week from the Washington Post, asserting that some of the documents found were relevant to the nuclear capabilities of an unnamed country. Well, that sounds to Ty Cobb like a leak. Might have come from the Justice Department, who knows? But the leaks are bad, and they are injurious to anyone's overall interests who's subject to a federal investigation, as clearly former President Trump is. Now, some of the things are not unclear. Were there documents at Mar-a-Lago? Yes, absolutely. Were there classified documents? Absolutely. Were some of them of the highest level of security classification? Absolutely. Were they kept in a secure place to the government's satisfaction? No, they weren't. Those things really aren't contested at all. Those are facts. And is there an underlying law that says that's a criminal offense? Yes, there is. The great question, and this goes to the timeline, is will there be a third party independent of the Justice Department and independent of the Trump attorneys to sift these things, separate out things that are not relevant to the underlying law and the possible violation of it, give those things back to former President Trump, and will that process, for a good period of time, slow down the investigation itself, possibly delaying any further action by the Justice Department? That clearly appears to be what's going to happen. Bill Barr, the former Attorney General, on Fox earlier this week called it a rain delay. He said, but it's not going to change the underlying set of facts or the trajectory of this investigation. As a former Attorney General, not once but twice, Bill Barr knows a lot more about this than I do, and he seems to be making that appraisal. And I asked Ty Cobb if he thought that was the correct way to think about it. I said, is the special master kind of an umpire? And he said, yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And I said, well, let's extend the baseball metaphor. Is this a rain delay? And he said, probably.
So it was the appointing of a special master. There are a lot of people who think it's a political thing. Was that the motivation for it, do you think?
Politics?
Yes.
So, look, I really resist the temptation, and it is something that flows through our conversation about our judicial process in ways I'm simply not comfortable with. I even regret that in my world, my industry, we're constantly applying to people in judicial positions the president whom appointed them, as if they're acting at that person's behest, not reading the law and not reading the precedent. And I don't want to suggest that someone appointed by one president, whether it's a Democrat or Republican, is that kind of president's justice to begin with. I'm uncomfortable with that phraseology. But politics or questions about politics seem to be everywhere. Yes, did former President Trump appoint this particular judge, Eileen Connor? Does that mean she's doing former President Trump's bidding? I don't want to assume that. Did the Trump lawyers search for that to be a possibly more sympathetic courtroom and judge? Yes, they did. That's not an uncommon practice in American law. So these things are true, but it doesn't mean they're determinative. And for the Justice Department, it does have, I think, if not under the law, under the public perception of the law, a higher barrier to reach. Why? Because of the things we've learned about the illegitimate origins of the Crossfire Hurricane investigation into former President Trump arising from the whole Russia Steele dossier. Look, those things happened and they were wrong. Don't believe me, believe the own FBI Inspector General who said they were wrong, who said the FBI completely ignored its own processes, procedures, and went completely out of bounds in setting that investigation in motion. Well, who was the target? Then President Trump. Do those who support him and look at the way this is happening now think, wait a minute, have we seen this movie before? I think the Justice Department does have, if not under law, but under simply public perceptions, a higher burden. And maybe this special master will help the public feel better about what's being asserted and what's being alleged in a matter like this because of that history.
Major, we know that there were the most sensitive top secret documents at Mar-a-Lago and that there are criminal laws regarding that type of confidentiality. So what could happen to Trump? If it's just a regular person or someone in the military who breaks those laws, that person most likely is in prison. What are we looking at potentially with the former president?
It's a really good question, Amy, and I'm glad you raised it in the way you did. I've talked to people who work in this world, military and otherwise, who say, Major, dang it, they use stronger language. I will save the audience that. Dang it, Major, if this were me in my previous life at military service X, Y, or Z, or at this agency unnamed, I would already be in jail. I would already be held and probably moments away, if not days away, from a full-blown indictment. And they said, that's not even discussable. That's a fact. And there's a whole history in our government of people even releasing things that are sensitive but unclassified that the government doesn't want out, being either arrested and living under the threat of prosecution. So there's that. So this is a real crime, and it's a real issue. And let's just remind ourselves, as President Trump signed legislation increasing the penalties for the mishandling of classified information. So he identified it through his presidency in collaboration with Congress to make this a bigger crime. But as Ty Cobb says on The Takeout, and you'll hear it when it is available on all podcast platforms Friday morning, he finds it hard to believe that a former president of the United States, who, as he said, is in a different category than you or me or anyone else, maybe ought not to be, but is, would be indicted for a quote-unquote process crime. There would have to be evidence that whatever these sensitive documents were, something was being done with them that was doubly injurious to the United States. Not just that they were there and they were in an insecure place and that's a bad idea. That something other was happening and that other thing is another crime. Ty Cobb said, it's my feeling, and again, quoting him, that as a former attorney for the president of the United States, Donald Trump, he's in much bigger legal jeopardy for everything attendant to and around January 6th. That's his opinion, and I just convey it, and the show will convey it as well.
Really looking forward to that next Takeout podcast. Again, you can find that on Twitter at Takeout Podcast. And I want to remind everybody, Major, the book is coming out. What is it? Is it 2 weeks? It's a little less than 2 weeks. The Big Truth
September
is coming
20th.
out. Are you counting the days?
I am.
I mean, I know it's a lot. You put a lot of work into this. I mean, every author I've ever spoken to is like the last week or two is like is almost the worst part because the anticipation is just building.
Well, I have the book. I've sent it out to some friends, and so I have it. It's great. I'm very proud of it. It's the 5th book I've written, and when I was a young journalist, I never wanted to make $1 million. I knew because of the chosen profession, I wasn't going to. I wanted to write one book before I was 40. It turns out my first book was out before I was 35, and I have 5 to my credit now, and that's one of the things I'm most satisfied and proud of in my journalism career.
Now, people can find out more about it in pre-order at thebigtruthbook.com. Always fun talking, Major. We'll catch you next week. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you.
You got it. Major Garrett is the chief Washington correspondent for CBS News on Twitter at Major CBS. And by the way, if you go there, you'll find the links to the Takeout podcast, to the book, the whole deal, anything you want to find out about that we just talked about. You can find him on Twitter at Major CBS. All right, coming up next, we'll tell you what's trending right here on the show.